skin tone, black. In other words, you can get to those destinations in any which way you want. If you spot meter for the eye, well, of course, now you've got a bit of dark in there. So you see how it's gone darker. If you actually expose for shadows, then that's going to be a problem too, because now you're blowing everything out even more. So you just have to pick a system that you like and stick to it. As far as I'm concerned, I like to shoot on manual, and I'm emulating what aperture priority does. So let me explain. So if I go to manual, independent of our conversation that we've had up to this point, if I go to manual and then I look at my screen here, let's ignore the fact that in mirrorless what you see is what you get. But if I'm shooting on manual, then I might start at this point. Okay, so let's say, for example, if you are not shooting in mirrorless and you're looking at your subject matter and you are using aperture priority, let's in fact go to matrix metering. So we're back on matrix evaluative metering mode, and I want to talk about now if we don't have any of the extremes. So in this case, we have Sally, she's wearing a white dress, we've got the black background, and at the moment I'm shooting aperture priority, and on matrix mode, metering mode, it's a pretty decent exposure. Although of course we've got to take everything into account. Now watch what happens when I have more negative space with black. Not going to move anything here. Watch what happens to the exposure. See, now that the camera is seeing more black, it's freaking out and saying, well, I don't like black. I actually want to go mid-gray, and it's making what was once black mid-gray, and of course it's overexposing her skin tone and overexposing the white dress. That's a problem. So we have to know that the minute you actually introduce anything other than white and black, you have to compensate accordingly. So let's see now, let's emulate it. 400 speed, 2.8, 400 ISO. I'm going to flick to manual and do the exact same thing. 400th of a second, 2.8, 400 ISO. And now what we'll do, let's lean towards the minus. What did we say? If something is dark, you go dark, lean towards the minus. In this case, we've got more dark than anything else. I like to emulate what I see in front of me like a paint palette, like putting it in a paint bucket. Right now, we have, in fact, let's do this. I'm going to go now to the picture control, to monochrome. So we sort of void ourselves of any sort of color bias. Yes, there's not much color. The only color that we really have is her sort of red lips and the skin tone. And of course, you've got the black background, the white dress. Now that I've made it black, picture what you're seeing in this particular viewfinder now as a paint bucket. That's all it is. It's a paint bucket. And we mix those tones in, and what do we get? Well, we're actually going to get quite dark. It's going to be a dark gray because we only have a little bit of white, a little bit of skin tone, and mostly black. If we get a dark gray, the camera's going to make it a mid-gray, make it light and overexpose as we're seeing now. So what we have to do is, of our exposure triangle, use 1, 2, or 3 of the things that affect exposure, aperture, ISO, or shutter speed, and then bring ourselves underexposed by what the camera is saying. In this case, I am going to use the shutter speed. So let me see how many clicks it takes. 1, 2, 3. So there we have it. We've got detail in the whites. We've got detail in the skin tones. The blacks are looking pretty good. Maybe we go one more, maybe 4. There we go. And it depends on the monitor that you're actually watching this tutorial on right now, but we're about 4 clicks. In other words, if you have subject matter that occupies about a bit less than a third of a frame, not quite a quarter, but a third of the frame with mostly black, then you know you're going to be about 3 or 4 clicks to the under. So we've looked at a white subject matter, we've looked at dark subject matter, but what happens if you have something in between? And of course, we're not looking at black or white, we're looking at different colors in normal environment. You have skin tones, you have different color dresses and things like that. So right now what I'm trying to do is emulate a scene that is quite typical. Now we have a brown part of the RV parking garage, we've got a gray background, that's a muslin background, we've got the white dress, we've got skin tone, we're back in normal color, and we're actually back on aperture priority, and we're on matrix metering mode or evaluative metering mode. So if I'm looking at this right now, if I'm shooting aperture priority, then it's, in other words, using the camera meter to give me what it believes to be a correct exposure, it's actually overexposing it. Well, why is that? Well, if you look at all those tones, we have to first convert them to black and white for me to explain what I'm talking about. We're no longer looking at, let's say, a skin tone or a brown piece of wall or anything like that. Now we're just looking at shades of black to white. Now, you would say that this is close to correct exposure because you do have whites, you do have dark greys and things like that. But if you were to mix all those tones in, as we're doing right now, you would arguably say that that scene is darker than mid-grey. Therefore, the camera is deliberately overexposing it, but it actually thinks it's a correct exposure because, as we said, it has to have a standard. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to emulate this exposure in manual mode, so 500th of a second, 2.8, 400. 500th of a second, 2.8 at 400, and I believe it's a little bit bright. So I'm going to get my shutter speed or my ISO. In this case, I might get my ISO down actually. And I believe that is a good exposure. We've got beautiful detail in the skin, we've got detail in the dress, and that gives us a good exposure. So remember, you've got the polarizing white and black, and we know that's about 5 clicks, almost 2 stops under and over respectively, and in this case we're about 2/3 of a stop out of the exposure by what the camera is saying. So remember, what your job now is to do is to look at your subject matter not in terms of color but of tones of black to white. And if you're using your spot metering mode as we discussed, and let's do that in fact while I'm speaking about that right now, let's go to spot metering mode. And you'll see that as I move my spot in different places, let's go to aperture priority, you'll see how it'll affect the exposure. If you actually even grab your smart device out, your phone, you'll actually see that no matter where you are with your phone and you look at your subject matter, you can tap on that particular part of it and it would give you, again, a mid-grey sort of reading. You have to know that the camera can't think like a human, so you have to over or underexpose accordingly or compensate accordingly to get your correct exposure. So when you're in an environment like this, if you don't have mirrorless, of course mirrorless is easy because what you see is what you get. I can clearly see that's a bad exposure. That you actually have to look at your scene, and if you were to go on to manual, and if you were to actually go to matrix metering again, okay, so let's say we're right there, we're focusing on the eye, and we've already determined that being a correct exposure. I'm saying is you have to diagnose that scene, put those tones in all involved, and then compensate accordingly based upon what you're seeing. Once we know that, then you're always going to be within a pocket of a 3rd stop increment. And if you take a shot and have to look at the back of the camera, great, you're looking for detail in the highlights, detail in the skin tones, detail in the whites. I let that be my guide. I'm not looking for detail in shadows to determine my exposure, because if I have a deep, dark shadow and a strong piece of sunlight hitting that bride's face, for example, and I'm after detail in the shadow, of course, the actual skin tone is going to be white. I'm going to have no detail whatsoever. So I let the highlights on the skin, I let the highlight on the dress, if we're talking about weddings, a white dress usually, that's going to be my guide. And the rest usually takes care of itself. Let's talk about white balance. Now, yes, if you're shooting in RAW, you can actually fix up anything afterwards in RAW conversion, no problem. And you might just say it's easy to put it on auto white balance, and that's basically it. The problem is that when there is a problem, when you have got the wrong color temperature in a photograph, then you're going to have to change almost every single shot. Because let's say, for example, I'm photographing a scene like this and I'm cropping up close. And then I'm shooting on auto white balance, and then I widen my angle of view and start incorporating different elements into my frame, it will change the white balance. So I would prefer you to actually choose a specific Kelvin degree, whether it's actually choosing your color temperature specifically, or arguably a preset will be a lot easier. So you know the presets, right? So let's go to them right now. Go to the white balances. Of course, you've got auto, you've got direct sunlight. Now, direct sunlight is 5,000 Kelvin. Cloudy, you got 5,700. Shade, you got 7,250. Incandescent, 2,950. And fluorescent is 4,000 Kelvin degrees. And then flash, you got 6,150 Kelvin degrees. And of course, you can actually choose the exact temperature that you basically want if you wish. or you can actually pick a particular preset. Now, my suggestion is pick a preset because it'll be consistent. Let's say, for example, if in one particular scene you screw up the temperature, then in raw conversion you can globally grab all those shots and fix them rather than have to go through 3 images here, 4 images there, that wide shot, that close-up shot, everything will have a different white balance. So keep it consistent. So what do the white balances do for that matter? And why should we look at it a bit closer? So let's look at it right now. So right now we're looking at Sally. Let's just get a good exposure here. So we're looking at an exposure of around 400th of a second, 4.5, 640 ISO. It's superfluous based upon the actual conversation we're having right now, and that is white balance. So right now, as you can see, it's on daylight white balance. We're basically saying this is the sun or daylight. Okay, so let's now, we're direct sunlight. It's not direct sunlight. We're actually in the shade of a garage, but we're choosing daylight because it actually looks quite realistic and it looks okay. Watch what happens now that we return the white balance to cloudy. So if you want cloudy, it will simply go warmer. And if you look at the difference, it's quite huge. In fact, what we'll do is this. I'll go back, I'll take a shot, then I will go cloudy, take another shot. That looks quite pleasing to the eye. Let's go shade, even warmer still. Now let's look at the differences here. So we've got, see, now that you compare them, now you realize which one's going to be better. In this case, we've got daylight, we've got cloudy, and we've got shade. So it really depends on your personal preference. Now, you've got to be careful because some people who already have darker skin, who have gone tanning or anything like that, they're going to almost look like Oompa Loompas if you go too far with your white balance. So now, how do we think of white balance? What makes us understand it? Well, let's think about this for a moment. If we're shooting in direct sunlight, we're basically saying we're using a warm light source. So the sun is a warm light source. It's warm. So we're basically saying, okay, sun, you've already got a warm tone, then I think that this will be, what I see with my own 2 eyes, this will look realistic. Great. If we're shooting with a cloudy white balance, let's say, for example, here, we're in actually an open shade, but let's say the clouds go above the sun and now we're shooting cloudy. The clouds are filtering that light. It's no longer as warm, it's a little bit colder. So what we're saying to the camera by choosing the cloudy white balance, I want to warm this up a little bit. In this case, we're in the shade of an RV parking here, so the shade of a building. We're basically saying it's actually a cold color temperature, so we want to warm things up a little bit. And therefore, we get this particular skin tone. Now, I actually think somewhere in between is probably about right. And you can see the difference between, like I said, right now we're seeing direct sunlight white balance. We're actually seeing the cloudy, and then now we're seeing shade. And of course, as we go further up in the food chain, so to speak, you are going to get polarizing color temperatures. So let's do that, for example. Let's deliberately choose incandescent. What we're saying to the camera, or to the camera, we're saying we are shooting with, let's say, could be a man-made light globe, tungsten light globe, or candlelight. And you are going to see that this is going to be blue. Do you see what happens? Is that we're basically saying that if our subject matter was illuminated with a very yellow, warm light source, this would correct it. But we're using this in this environment and she looks dead. Now, if I was photographing guys and I deliberately wanted to make a shot look cool in 2 senses of that word, cool as in, it's got a cool vibe, or cool as in cold, then that's a masculine look and that could work. So be careful on where you're using this, but you would use incandescent in exactly what it implies, with an incandescent light, man-made tungsten light globes, and possibly even candlelight. Now, candlelight's going to be warmer, but so you have to just determine what color temperature you prefer yourself. Now, here's the thing, and if you don't like these color temperatures, you can simply change them. Let's see what happens when we go auto. Now, auto has actually done a pretty good job here. Now, you might say, well, fantastic, Jerry, I'll use it all the time. But don't forget, the minute we start introducing new elements in this particular frame, it will not be consistent. So just remember, although it might give you a pretty good result. In most situations, it won't be consistent. So play around with your color temperatures. My advice to you is to go to your favorite raw conversion software. Let's say, for example, you use Lightroom. And as you look at the photograph that you've taken as shot, you will know the actual preset white balance that you chose, and slide them left and right, and you'll begin to realize that maybe all this time you've been shooting with direct sunlight and you prefer cloudy or vice versa. So have fun with it. Don't overcomplicate it, but just know too that if you want to get perfect color, you might do a custom white balance. You may even photograph a color picker in your particular frame. But I only do that when it comes to maybe shooting fashion, where it's so critical to get that color absolutely perfect of the dress, more actually important than even skin tone. So you can do that as well. So take that, run with it, have some fun with your presets, but my advice to you is make your life easier, get it right in camera as close as possible, and be consistent. Arguably the most important element in the exposure triangle is aperture. How much light we're letting through the iris of the lens, and how many things we want in focus. We call that depth of field. So what we're going to do now is actually going to look into the camera and notice what an f-stop will actually do in terms of it being wider. What does 1.8 look like all the way till, say, f22. Every lens will have different compression, of course, and actually behave differently with the same f number. For example, f4 with a longer focal length, there'll be actually less depth of field, let's say, than a wider angle lens with the same f number, say f4, for example, in this case. So what I want to do now is look through the camera. Of course, as we can see here, we've just got this plant in front of us with different leaves, and I've actually set the camera, dare I say it here, to auto ISO, but it's giving us a nice exposure. So I've focused on a particular leaf there, as you can see, right there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the aperture from 1.8, and I want you to start looking at how many more things we have in focus, foreground and background. You can sort of see how we're getting that less milkiness in the background. In this case, we don't really have bokeh, and I know that a lot of people love that word bokeh. With this particular lens, I've got the range from f16 all the way down to 1.8. Now, it's important to note that many people think that focus starts from where you focus from and it goes backwards. In other words, depth of fields, you may believe that starts from that point of focus and working backwards. So for example, if you're photographing, say, me at a very shallow depth of field, let's say it may be at 1.8 or f2, if you focus on my eye socket, where the glass of the eye meets the eye socket, and you feel that the actual focus is about this deep and it goes backwards, then you might miss my eyelash. Now, yes, that may happen depending on what lens you use, but this information is extremely important, especially when you're photographing groups of people. Let's say, for example, this particular lens looking at me right now, you're looking at a bird's eye view of 3 layers of people in a family group shot, okay? So bird's eye view, these are the top of the heads. If you actually photograph at f4 at the tip of that person's nose or eyes, and then your depth of field, let's say, for example, is like this, then what happens is we're missing focus. So what you have to do, first of all, understand that focus starts 1/3 in and 2/3 back. So if you are photographing 3 people, for example, you will not actually focus on the tip of that first person's eye or nose. You will actually focus on the tip of that person's nose or eyes on that second level. And now we have 1/3 in and 2/3 back. And of course, you have to determine what f-stop is going to be needed for your subject matter and appropriate to the lens choice that you basically have. So the example that I did just now, it's very elementary, it's very fundamental, but what we're just trying to ascertain here is the fact that if you are shooting at, let's say, an f-stop number at f1.2, 1.4, 1.8, you are going to have less things in focus, and then as you get deeper in focus, you are going to get more. In other words, f16, f22 is where you get more things in focus. You simply have to choose the actual appropriate f number or the f-stop based upon the subject matter that you're photographing. So don't overthink it, but also don't play with fire. Never photograph family photographs at 1.2 or f2 or anything like that. The way I like to think about it, depending on the lens choice that you have, if you photograph 2 people, then that might give you permission to photograph at 2.8 because you've got the 2 people right there their eyes are on the same sort of plane of focus, and then you can arguably get them in focus. If you're photographing 4 people, you might want to shoot with f4, 5 people, 5.6, 8 people, f8, and so on. Now, yes, that's not an absolute, and of course we said before that if you're photographing with a wider angle lens, that same f-stop, like f8 for example, on a wider angle lens, your depth of field might be like this, but with a longer focal length and lens, your depth of field might be like this. So just make sure you understand your lenses, understand the genre that you're photographing. Don't overthink it, guys. Aperture is actually really easy. Just determine how many things you want in focus, know the limitations of your lens based upon the genre that you're photographing, and have some fun.